our second book is called Static, because in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, all we get is ever more static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need is the dictionary definition of static. That's what we need the media to give us. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And that is where I want to end. The media that covers the movements that create static and make history. We begin and end standing up to the madness with the story of Rosa Parks. Now, even here in Canada, I'm sure you know the story, because it is told so frequently. I mean, in the United States, every kid learns it, but they learn it wrong. Rosa Parks, December 1st, 1955, sits down on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, in the front of the bus and refuses to get up for a white passenger. And she's arrested. That night, her colleague, Joanne Robinson, also an African-American woman, mimeographs. Do you still know that word, mimeograph? Mimeographs 35,000 flyers to hand out to begin the Montgomery bus boycott, to challenge the segregation of the transportation system of Montgomery, Alabama. And a few days later, December 5th, 1955, when Rosa Parks goes to court, the Montgomery Improvement Association, a grassroots organization, has its meeting, and they choose as their leader a young minister who's just come into town, the young Dr. Martin Luther King. In a sense, Rosa Parks launches Dr. Martin Luther King. Within a year, the bus system of Montgomery becomes integrated, the Supreme Court rules, and history is made in the United States because this woman dared to sit down. And in so doing, she stood up for not only African Americans, but for all of us. Because if one of us is diminished, we are all diminished. And the way the media got it wrong is when she died a few years ago, you know, Democracy Now! Raced to Washington. She was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Then her body was brought to a Washington church. Thousands came out for the memorial service, and then she was flown to Detroit where the big funeral was. Oprah came to Washington Church, and Cicely Tyson, and we were outside where it's often more interesting to be. Big loudspeakers, kids had come, old women had come. I interviewed a college student, a young woman who said she emailed her professors that morning to say, I won't be in class, I'm going to get an education. And I interviewed a 91-year-old woman, an older African-American woman, who said, I did this 14 years before Rosa. In the North, I clutched my book, acting like I was reading, and when the bus driver said, get to the back of the bus, I just refused. And you know, other women in Montgomery had sat down on the bus before Rosa. In fact, Rosa herself sat down on the bus before she sat down on the bus, December 1st, 1955. But this was the magic moment. And you can never know when that moment will come. Maybe it has. Maybe an opening has occurred. When you can then, with all the power of your organizing and what you've done before, laying the foundation that will change history. And that's what Rosa Parks did. The media, when she died, said Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress who just sat down on the bus. She was no troublemaker, but that's where they got it wrong. She was a first-class troublemaker. Rosa Parks was a local secretary of the NAACP. She came out of fighting for years against racism and segregation. She worked with the president of the NAACP, E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. Together, they've been challenging the segregation laws. She'd gone to the Highlander Center in Tennessee, black and white together, learning to effectively strategize to change the laws of the United States. It's where Dr. King went as well. Rosa Parks knew exactly what she was doing. She was an activist. And the media denigrates activists. But what could be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? And to show how brave she was. This is 1955. You know, when Barack Obama went bowling during the primary, he was a terrible bowler. That image of him bowling right into the gutter was shown hundreds of times on television. But there was such an important story to tell there, and we did it on Democracy Now! South Carolina State, 40 years ago. Story very few people know now because the media doesn't bring us the history that we need to understand where we need to go from here and who has done it and how they did it in the past. South Carolina State, students simply going outside a bowling alley to protest that African Americans were not allowed to bowl there. This happened 40 years ago this year, and the police moved in and they opened fire on the protesters, killing a number of them. So when I saw Barack Obama bowling, however bad his score was, it was truly a miracle to watch. And people all over the country, if they knew what others had done to pave the way, that's our job in the media, is to tell those stories from the past, to open the microphones for everyone. And when people can't tell their stories, like the thousands rounded up in the United States after September 11th, we don't know their names, mainly South Asian, Arab Americans, Muslims, many of them deported. When they can't tell their stories, it's our job to tell their stories until they can tell their own. But back to Rosa, and this is where I'll end. To show how powerful and brave she was, you just go back a few months in 1955, half a century ago, to Emmett Till. 14-year-old boy in Chicago. His mother sends him to Money, Mississippi to be with family for the summer. African-American child. And he goes down to visit his family, and a white gang to a family pulls him from his family's home in the middle of the night. They drag him out, they torture him, and he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. They say he wolf whistled at a white woman. He's 14 years old. And when his body was sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, did something remarkable. She said she wanted the coffin open, the casket for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. And thousands streamed by his casket and saw, and Jet magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head, and they published them in their publications, and they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country, of our country in the United States. Seared into our consciousness. Mamie Till Mobley had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? We saw the babies dead on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. We saw the images of women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs. We saw the soldiers dead and dying for just 1 week. The front pages of our newspapers, top stories of the newscasts on radio and television. I don't think Barack Obama could then be able to talk about a surge in Afghanistan. Because if we saw these images, Americans are a compassionate people, they would say no. War is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now!